The Vienna Wiesenthal Institute is very proud and very honored for this afternoon lecture, which is coming now, and I'm personally very happy that Professor Hasia Deiner is coming to us. Normally, I think international conferences have something called a keynote address, which is before the conference or the evening before the Holocaust, before the conference. Sorry. Now, it's because of a time problem we had with Hasia Deiner. We are very happy that she finally could come here, and that is the reason we called it the afternoon lecture. It's a very ideal constellation now, because we have a fellow here. She is a specialist on the topic Hasia Deiner has chosen, and she will chair now. I'm giving the floor to Elisabeth Gallas. Thank you very much, Professor Deiner, for coming to Vienna and giving us the honor to deliver this lecture.
So also from me, a very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's keynote lecture of Hasia Deiner under the title, No Generation of Silence, Postwar American Jews and the Memory of the Holocaust. I have to repeat, we're very glad and honored that you followed the invitation to join us at this conference and share your knowledge about early post-war Jewry and its numerous ways to come to terms with the recent past of war and Holocaust. Before we hear your presentation, I would like to shortly introduce you to our audience. Hasia Deiner holds several positions at New York University. She's a Paul S. and Sylvia Steinberg Professor for American Jewish Studies, a Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies, and she's the Director of the Goldstein-Goren Center for American Jewish History. She got her PhD and her MA at Chicago University in History. She published lengthily about Jewish history in America, covering different aspects such as migration, identities, gender, space, and memory, and patterns of commemoration and documentation of the Holocaust among Jews in America in the 40s and 50s stand at the center of her latest and celebrated book, We Remember with Reverence and Love American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, 1945 to 1962, which was published by New York University Press in 2009. It's from these findings of her research we will hear now, and I thank you very much for coming. So the floor is yours.
Okay, should I get from here? What do you think? Okay, I think up there. Okay. So first I want to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor. So without any further ado. So in 1952, the American Jewish Congress, which was the largest mass membership body, organization of kind of among the American Jewish defense organizations, called together a small committee with a very specific task. This committee made up of a few rabbis, a few historians, a couple poets, one or two Hebraic scholars, were asked to compose a reading for home use at the Passover Seder, the Pesach Seder, and also for public gatherings, which was to sanctify the memory of the Jews who perished under Nazi rule. This committee did as charged and composed a short text, 3 paragraphs in English, 3 paragraphs in Hebrew, which they entitled the Seder of Remembrance. And it is indeed from that text which I drew the words for the title of my book, We Remember with Reverence and Love. So I want to begin by just sharing something of this, again, very brief prayer with you. So the first paragraph was basically an invocation. We remember with reverence and love the 6 million of our brothers of the European exile who died at the hands of a tyrant more wicked than Pharaoh, who enslaved our fathers in the land of Egypt. Come, said he unto his minion, let us cut them off from being a people, that the name of Israel be remembered no more. They slew the blameless and the pure, men, women, and children, with vapors of poison, with ovens and gas. Okay, but we will not dwell on the deeds of the evil ones, lest we defame the image of God in which man was created. That's the first paragraph. The English and the Hebrew, very good translation of each other. In fact, I don't know if it was composed in Hebrew and translated into English, or composed in English and translated into Hebrew. The second paragraph dealt specifically with the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, and in it, I'm not going to quote the whole paragraph, but they compare the fighters of the Ghetto uprising to Judah Maccabee in days of old, who brought honor and glory to to the name of Israel. Again, excellent Hebrew-English parallel language. It was only in the third paragraph that there was something of a divergence from the Hebrew and the English. So the third paragraph, and this will be my English translation of the Hebrew, it said, "From the depths, the martyrs opened their mouths in a song, I believe, with full faith in the coming of the Messiah, and though he may be delayed, I still believe." Obviously, "Ani ma'amin b'viat HaMashiach," words from Maimonides. So fairly simple two sentences in English. In Hebrew, the English was different and was cast in a very decided post-war note of American liberalism. So here's the English as printed in this Seder of Remembrance, a text which I will tell you was used very broadly throughout the 1950s and 1960s. So from the depths, the martyrs lifted their voices in a song of faith and hope in a day when justice and brotherhood would reign among men. The words of the Seder of Remembrance encapsulated much about the ways in which American Jews in the post-war period had to say and do about the Holocaust and how they wove it into their communal lives. Metaphorically, along with the writers of the text, the Seder of Remembrance, as well as the users of it, American Jews participated in building a culture which, text by text, artifact by artifact, and political act by political act, gave the Holocaust a prominent place in their communal culture. When they gathered in Jewish spaces and when they faced the larger American public, they invoked the all too horrendous devastation which had taken place in Europe. Now, they employed a range of words to denote this event. Okay, the Seder of Remembrance doesn't call it anything. As we remember with reverence and love the 6 million of our brothers, and it doesn't name the phenomenon. Another text that I came upon referred to Hitler's dark reign of terror. Such common phrases as Hitler times showed up often in the literature. The catastrophe with a lowercase c, the catastrophe with an uppercase c, the great catastrophe, the Hitler catastrophe, the European catastrophe, the recent catastrophe, all got used, along with the 6 million, the tragedy, the concentration camps, and the like. Again, I'm going to give, by the way, for every sort of statement I make, a few examples, and you will just have to take it on faith and hopefully have a chance to read the longer version in the book, that each example, underneath each example, stands a kind of mountain range of other ways of seeing the same phenomenon. So the program notes for a concert of Jewish music that was held in Chicago in 1953 by the Halevi Society identified in the program that this Halevi Society would be singing a Yankele, lullaby by Mordechai Gebertik, and they identified Gebertik as, quote, a victim of the crematoria. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union, still heavily Jewish and predominantly Jewish in its leadership, still had a Yiddish newspaper in the early 1950s, described it as the, quote, accursed Hitler period, while a 1954 study guide published by the B'nai B'rith, entitled What Do You Know About Jewish Religion, History, Ethics, and Culture, referred to this phenomenon as Hitler's ghastly program of extermination. Notably, the word Holocaust was used as well. It was sometimes a lowercase h, it was sometimes, again, a capital H. It sometimes was preceded by an adjective, the European Holocaust, the Hitler Holocaust, and the like. In 1949, the Jewish Museum in New York mounted an exhibit of the works of the American Jewish painter Abraham Wolkowitz, and in the description handed out to museum goers to describe these paintings, which had been produced in America at the turn of the century, the brochure said, quote, these children, so that's the children who are depicted in Wolkowitz's paintings, that these children, since the time these paintings have been made, quote, half a century has passed. These children have become grandparents. They have witnessed the Nazi Holocaust, which threatened the very existence of the Jews. So the word Holocaust was used in tandem with, in concert with many other words. Nobody seemed terribly bothered about not having a single term to denote this event. In Yiddish, the press, the poets, the novelists, the host of radio shows, the orators, the survivors who spoke at public gatherings, the compilers of Yiskerbücher memorial books, the writers of pedagogic material for Yiddish schools also didn't have one word that trumped all others. They wrote about Hitlerzeiten, Hitler Times. If they had one word, or if there was a single word that appeared most often, it was simply Churban, the destruction. The letzter Churban, the most recent destruction, der größer Churban, the great destruction, and indeed quite often they refer to it as der dritter Churban, the third destruction, making the events wrought by the Germans in the period of the 1940s as something as cataclysmic as the destructions of the first and second temples in ancient days. But whatever they called it, and in whatever language they used, they posed the catastrophe in both deeply Jewish and broadly universal terms. So the Seder of Remembrance, which talked about our brothers, and which relied upon the pronoun we and our and us, also lived very comfortably with those final words that the survivors looked forward to a day when, quote, justice and brotherhood would reign among men, offering in that a very universal vision of what might grow out of this phenomenon. Talk about the tragic fate of the 6 million permeated all of American Jewish life, and it spanned all the spectrum, all the strands of American Jewish identity and communal organization. Reform, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, and conservative Jews, that is, through the denominational bodies, despite their different stances towards Judaism as a religious system, all made room for the Holocaust in their synagogues, seminaries, and publications. They did so very differently. The Reform and the Orthodox had very different things to say about the meaning of the Holocaust and explaining why it happened, but all of them integrated into their communal programs and into the very fundamentals of their denominational bodies. So too, and I'm not going to just spew forth the names of a number of American Jewish organizations, and these happen to be the organizations whose papers I looked at, but there are many more that I didn't. So the B'nai B'rith, the Jewish War Veterans, the Jewish Labor Committee, the American Jewish Committee, the National Council of Jewish Women, Hadassah, Pioneer Women, the American Jewish, the culture clubs, the Jewish community centers in English, Yiddish, and Hebrew, all recalled the 6 million and contemplated the aftermath of the slaughter in ways that defined who they were in the present. Within that context, there were individuals, both within and outside of these organizations, who found ways to make the events of the Churban a part of their organizational culture. Some put words on paper conveying emotions, fact, and ideas through articles, oratory, sermons, crafting liturgies for home and synagogue use, fashioning a vast, unorganized, spontaneous project which sought to keep alive something of the memory of those Jews who had been murdered in Europe. Some American Jews, on their own or under the auspices of Jewish institution, chiseled references to the tragedy onto stone. Others turned to music, recording and performing a repertoire of works, which, again, grew out of the Holocaust. Those able created dramas, dances, pageants, poems, radio shows, scholarly works, and graphic images, which took as their subject something about those Jews who met this tragic fate. Larger numbers, obviously, watched, listened, and read. Okay, that is, most people don't create those kinds of texts, but they consume them, and as such made the Holocaust an organic part of American Jewish public culture. Now, I'm just going to offer a few examples of this. Throughout the United States, in large communities and in small ones, an annual Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Program was held. Okay, the larger the city, the more such programs there were. The smaller the community, there would be only one for the entire Jewish population. So the yearly Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Program was one which became iconic in post-war America. Rabbis associated with the Synagogue Council of America attempted to create a memorial day. Okay, and through a series of negotiations and arguments within the Synagogue Council, they focused on the 10th of Tevet, okay, one of the traditional fast days in the Jewish calendar, to be earmarked as a moment to, or a day in Jewish time to remember the recent calamity, as they called it. The conservative movement, at that point America's largest Jewish denomination, in its 1951 High Holiday Prayer Book, offered an entire page, quote, to our beloved 6 million as part of the martyrology. So all of these were memorial efforts, and certainly there were many more. Now, much of what American Jews did and said about the calamitous Hitler times, however, went beyond just memorializing for its own sake. It went beyond remembering pure and simple, but rather their concern for remembering sprang from specific political and communal concerns. As shareholders in the largest, wealthiest, most unfettered, politically robust, and institutionally elaborate Jewish community in the world, they, and basically they alone, could take on the many practical tasks which they believed remembering the victims would help them shoulder. These were tasks or chores that had fallen upon their shoulders in the wake of the calamity. And so what I'd like to do now is just to look at a number of those tasks undertaken by American Jews through which they invoked the Holocaust and which provided a forum for discussing the Holocaust both within the Jewish world and to the larger American public. So American Jews, and they pretty much alone, in the period after the end of the war, raised the money that was necessary to aid the survivors who had come through the devastation. Only American Jewry had the resources to support the remnant of European Jewry, and in the years that the survivors needed assistance, vast sums flowed from American Jews to these projects. It is still estimated that keeping the value of money and the gross national product in mind, that this still is the single largest voluntary philanthropic undertaking in human history. So never have so few, because we're talking about a relatively small population. American Jews made up, there were about 5.5 million Jews in the United States. They made up about 4 to 5% of the American population. So never have so few raised so much money in so short a time. They created an avalanche of fundraising materials, written, radio programs, films, television programs, propaganda pamphlets, advertising, all undertaken to get people to give money to the survivors, and again, to give money, to have not just Jews give money, but non-Jews as well. A few examples. So Hadassah, the Women's Zionist organization, created hundreds of spots on the radio and again, broadcast on American radio to tell the story of the survivors. They would feature a child and tell that child's story, okay, hoping, again, people would hear it and then dig into their pockets and give money. So one such radio program was called How Can I Tell It? And it featured, quote, Sarah, about whom the records indicate that her parents, even as they sent her on, knew they were slated for deportation to a German labor camp. They were sure they would never see her again. Or the New Jersey Jewish News, very local paper, ran an advertisement to get people to give money, and it was in the form of a letter to American Jews from a Jewish child survivor. Okay, a letter actually to American Jewish children from a survivor. Dear children, no, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. It was from American Jewish children to Jewish children in Europe. Dear children, we will not let you die. We have resolved that you shall live, that your broken bodies shall be mended, that your broken lives made whole again. So across the spectrum of American Jewry was this fundraising kind of engine, and every time the fundraising engine went into gear, they repeated the story of what had happened, often on a very personal level, sometimes writ large. Probably the most dramatic example of this happened in May of 1953, when one of the most popular television shows in America at the time, which was entitled This Is Your Life. It's a program where a person, unbeknownst to him or herself, would be brought on stage and they would tell that person's life story as people from their past would reminisce about what they had done. So in May of 1953, the United Jewish Appeal asked Hazel Bishop, which was the advertiser for this program, to give them 1 hour for This Is Your Life, and they had a Holocaust survivor, a woman named Hannah Konar, who came on, and her life was narrated by people who she had known in her childhood in Czechoslovakia. She was a survivor. At the beginning of the show and at the end of the show, Hazel Bishop said, "We are having no advertisements for this program tonight, and all the money we would have spent on advertisement will go to the United Jewish Appeal for their Save Overseas Survivor campaign to help people like Hannah Konar, who were not lucky enough to have come to America already." So fundraising, telling the story of the Holocaust were inextricably bound to each other. Secondly, the Jews of the United States, the nation which emerged from World War II as the West's unmatched economic and political power, spent much energy not always successfully, and spent much time trying to make sure that the American public and that the American government not only remember that it was Germany which had perpetrated this crime against the Jewish people, but that those who had been responsible would be brought to justice in one way or another. So American Jews, through their organizations, monitored what they saw as the so-called, and they always had in quotes, rehabilitation. It was always in quotes of Nazis into public life in West Germany. They paid close attention to and warned public officials and the American public about the resurgence of Nazism and anti-Semitism in the new Germany. So, again, one of many, many examples that could be drawn from the material. In 1955, Adolf Held, who was the chairman of the Jewish Labor Committee, sent an impassioned letter to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles protesting the presence of vendors, quote, who are selling outspoken Nazi literature at the Frankfurt Book Fair. Now, this letter, which not only went to the Secretary of State, but was reprinted as a press release in hundreds of American newspapers, went on. So the Jewish Labor Committee official wrote, "We were shocked to learn that our government did not publicly protest to the fact that there are more than 20 West German publishing firms which issue almost exclusively memoirs of former leading Nazis, literature glorifying the barbarous acts of the Nazis." Now, in his letter, and in the press release of the letter, Held indicated very clearly why American Jews were so concerned about these vendors at the Frankfurt Book Fair selling Nazi material. Quote, "The death stench of the 6 million Jews who perished in the concentration camps has not yet evaporated from the memory of those who have survived." So very openly saying it's because of what happened that we are engaged in this public act. Notably, in one city after another, when German musical groups would come to the United States, the local Jewish Community Council, local Jewish community groups protested as they believed they could. A number of American cities entered into sister city relationships with German cities in the 1950s. And again, American Jews in those cities, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, St. Louis, protested that why should their city be twinned, okay, with a German city, a city which they believed had harbored those who had perpetrated this tragedy. So American Jews used the Holocaust to raise funds for the survivors. They used it to monitor and to protest the developments in Germany. They also made much of the Holocaust as they witnessed the political events of the post-war period. Any number of these events could be used. The Cold War, the American confrontation with the Soviet Union, and the American Civil Rights Movement, among others, offered Jews and Jewish organizations a chance to retell the story of the Holocaust in light of political developments. So again, just one example that will have to stand for so many others vis-a-vis the American Civil Rights Movement. In 1962, a large civil rights gathering held in Cincinnati featured among its speakers Harold Goldstein, chairman of the Jewish Community Relations Committee of that city. And in this, to the assembled throngs, African-American and white civil rights advocates, he said, "I want my country to grow strong and prosper because I remember what it was like to live in a world where people remained silent and quiescent, where Nazis killed 6 million Jews. I cannot be callous or indifferent to injustice to others." Okay, in 1963, there was an even broader statement of the same phenomenon on the day of the great March on Washington that I'm sure you're all familiar with, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Well, two speakers before Martin Luther King was Rabbi Joachim Prinz, who was then the president of the American Jewish Congress, and Prinz, in his speech representing American Jewry to the Mammoth Civil Rights Gathering, made reference to his own memories of having lived through the Nazi era before he fled to the United States. Likewise, as most, not necessarily all, but as most American Jews saw it, the policies pursued by the Soviet Union and the communist regimes of Eastern Europe after 1948 towards the Jews and towards Judaism was something to worry about, and it again allowed them to repeat details about the Holocaust years. So in 1953, the American Jewish Yearbook, published by the American Jewish Committee, featured an article by Lucy Dawidowitz, herself an outspoken anti-communist, about the fate of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Dawidowitz wrote, quote, "With the memory of Nazi Germany's murder of 6 million Jews fresh in their mind, American Jews are in the main convinced that only a tremendous worldwide protest could stop the further development of the anti-Semitic campaigns." So too, many of the era's hot-button political issues provided Jews through their organizations and as individuals with opportunities to talk about contemporary events and to make reference to the Holocaust. So I'm just going to choose one such example besides civil rights and the Cold War concern and critique about the Soviet Union, and this had to do with the Genocide Convention. So as you're probably familiar, the Genocide Convention was drafted by Raphael Lemkin, who was a Polish Jewish jurist who came to the United States. He was there as of 1940. His work was underwritten by the American Jewish Committee, and he had long been concerned about genocide. He actually, as a young man, developed an interest. He actually coined the word genocide, and he was very concerned about the fate of the Armenians in the 19-teens and 1920s. And when he came to the United States, when he fled to the United States in 1940, through his work with the American Jewish Committee, he drafted this document, the Genocide Treaty. And the idea is that it would be presented to the United Nations in one of its earliest meetings, and then it would be taken to each one of the nations of the world, and the goal was to declare genocide a crime against humanity. The United States was actually one of the last countries to pass it. Okay, it did not pass the Genocide Convention until 1989, while almost every other country passed it long before that. But every time the Genocide Convention came up in front of the United States Senate, which had to pass it, and again didn't, American Jewish organizations went into high gear lobbying for this piece of legislation. That is, they saw it as in the interest of American Jews to have the United States become a signatory to the to this document. The first time the Genocide Convention came up in front of the United States Senate, Jacob Blaustein, the president of the American Jewish Committee, testified, and his speech in front of this obviously very august body made very clear the comfort and the compulsion of American Jews to talk about the Holocaust. "I am appearing," he stated to the senators, "on behalf of the American Jewish Committee. We are concerned with genocide not only because 6 million Jews were recently murdered, but also because genocide is a crime against humanity, which the civilized movement must eradicate. The National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, the women of the Reform movement, every time the bill came up in front of the Senate, and it was, by the way, 1950, 1956, 1959, 1961, and beyond, they had massive letter-writing campaigns to senators trying to get them to pass. So in the 1956 National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods crusade for the Genocide Convention, they wrote to, again, their senators, Who better than the Jew can understand the awful catastrophe which can result when any nation sets out on the path to wipe out whole communities and people? We, they said, support it, quote, after viewing the ruins wrought by the Nazi Holocaust and witnessing the wholesale murder of 6 million Jews. Now, of all issues, however, which moved American Jewry in the period from the end of World War II into the early 1960s as a vehicle to engage with the Holocaust and to talk about it among themselves and to the larger American, on the larger American scene, probably none moved them more deeply than Israel. First, the effort to create a sovereign state, and then over the course of those years, to gain support for it in the United States. Now, this is not the place to talk about the geopolitics, about the recognition of Israeli sovereignty in 1947 at the UN, and then 1948, and was this connected to the Holocaust or not? That's kind of an issue for diplomatic historians, but certainly as American Jews saw it, there was an inextricable bond between the Holocaust and Israel. So in 1950, one voice from the world of American Orthodoxy, Professor Isaac Lewin of Yeshiva University, in a Yiddish book entitled Noch, keinen, or After the Destruction, made clear how the Holocaust and Israel were related phenomenon, and putting this in the light of the long course of Jewish history. The recent Churban, the book was entitled Noch, keinen, or After the Destruction, and he said that the emergence of Israel made this Churban different from all others, quote, because it was the greatest destruction of Jewish history and it created the reality of Jewish sovereignty. So Lewin went on in this book, which had previously been articles in a Yiddish newspaper, and he said, when the mourning for the 6 million martyrs had hardly begun, the Jewish people had taken up the task for which there was no precedent to build their home in Israel. Without help from the outside, the old wandering nation had come back to its home. Now, Lewin contended that, quote, the wild beasts, obviously the Germans, quote, did not leave behind even the smallest reminder of the victims. And he said that in some ways maybe that didn't matter so much anymore, that there were no markers, there were no memorials in the places where the Jews had been so brutally murdered, because he said, quote, the Jewish people can put up a memorial in the new home. Let the new settlements be named after the martyrs. Let the streets of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa, and all the other cities of Israel be the memorial markers for the ripped away sons and daughters of our people. Now, little of what American Jews did and said and produced about the Holocaust, whether remembering it for its own sake, as kind of memorials pure and simple, or deriving contemporary political lessons from it, existed in a hermetically sealed Jewish world. So, for example, those Warsaw Ghetto memorial programs always included the mayor and the congressman and other non-Jewish notables on the stage. And that is, they were there to witness American Jews or local Jews memorializing the Holocaust. American Jews generally made efforts to share their references and efforts to memorialize the 6 million with their non-Jewish neighbors. It mattered a great deal to them that the story got told to other Americans and that it got told correctly. So I'm going to share one very small local story with you, and listen a little closely, because there's something that maybe will cause some laughter, but it's actually pretty significant here. So I want you to listen to the words of a man named Mr. H. Kudlowitz. I say H because I don't know his first name. He happened to be the principal of a workman's circle school, that is a Yiddish school, in Dorchester, Massachusetts, a kind of working class neighborhood outside of Boston, in 1959. So in 1959, he wrote an enraged letter to the editor of the Boston Globe, which got published. kind of remarkably, it got published, and I saw it only because somebody clipped it and put it in a file for some other reason. But I think his words deserve to be quoted in full because they indicate not only American Jewry's widespread memorialization of the Holocaust, but the intensity of its interest in having the story told broadly and correctly. So here's Mr. Kudlowitz. To the editor, I am writing to tell you of drastic error in the May 4 Globe in the article covering the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. Now, just stand aside from this and say that if the Boston Globe on May 4th, 1959, covered the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial Program at the Yud Lamed Peretz Workmen's Circle School in Dorchester, it means that somebody in the school wrote to the paper and said, maybe you should send a reporter to cover this event. Okay, it's also very interesting because the Globe obviously did send a reporter and published an article about this memorial program in which the participants were probably 12-year-olds. So it's not exactly a major event in Boston on the Boston cultural scene. So back to Mr. Kudlowitz. Okay, it was printed. Okay, now I'm going to be speaking in the voice of the May 4 Globe. So, children of the I.L. Peretz Arbiter Ring School lit the candles, and later a reading in German gave a portrayal of life in the ghetto and the massacre by the Nazis, end quote. Now, Mr. Kudlowitz, in the first place, your reporter should have inquired as to the language used if it wasn't familiar to him. In the second place, it should have been apparent to the reporter that whatever language would have been used, it surely would not have been German. This was a memorial observance paying tribute to the 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the German Nazis. Therefore, it would seem incongruous to sing the praises of the martyred Jews in the German language. The children at the I.L. Peretz School rendered their portrayal in Yiddish, the language used by the Jews of Eastern Europe, and taught at the school itself. Since the appearance of your article, our school has received numerous telephone calls questioning our use of German in the program. We would appreciate a retraction of your error. Okay, I don't know if they got the retraction. Less important than the fact that when the school had the program, it contacted the paper, that the paper sent a reporter, and that Mr. Kudlowitz was aghast that the reporter had said that the children sang a song in German, or that the program was conducted in German. Now, the other part of Mr. Kudlowitz's letter is that the catastrophe, the Holocaust, came in the post-war period to serve a number of decidedly inner Jewish communal projects. Mr. Kudlowitz made that clear, too. He had a Jewish community up in arms, thinking that the Jewish children under his care were sent there to acquire Jewish knowledge and identity were learning German, the language of the perpetrators. As post-war American Jews began, different ones in different ways, calling for increased religious observance, enhanced Jewish education, greater Jewish creativity, enhanced Jewish life, they foregrounded the destruction of European Jewry. Those Jews, the ones who had been killed so brutally, communal leaders reminded the American Jewish public, had been the pillars of authentic Judaism. Their communities had been the well springs of Jewish culture, the fountains of Jewish inspiration. With the destruction of European Jewry, American Jews now had to pick up where the martyrs had left off. American Jews came to develop an idea that those who had been killed had been the true exemplars of authentic Judaism, and they, the Jews of the United States, were but shallow and pathetic copies, but not very authentic ones at all, of that authenticity which had been so brutally wiped out. American Jews were repeatedly told by their leaders that they now had to make up for what had been demolished. Only more Jewish knowledge, greater commitment, deeper understanding of the destroyed world of European Jewry could begin to compensate for those losses. The Holocaust lent an urgency to long-heard, actually, exhortations hurled by Jewish communal leaders at the rank and file of American Jews to become more Jewish. It offered moral intensity to both old and long-standing projects as well as new undertakings justified in the name of the Holocaust. So again, one of many possible examples, the historian Simon Ravidovich delivered the inaugural lecture at the opening of Chicago's College of Jewish Studies, 1948. So 1948, the city of Chicago for the first time has a, quote, College of Jewish Studies, intended primarily to train teachers to go out to Jewish schools. Ravidovich, at this inaugural ceremony, called upon the listeners, who were the students, the faculty, notable guests, non-Jews among them, as well as, probably most important, the school's financial backers, to remember that, quote, our brethren in the Polish ghettos under Hitler kept up the traditional idea of Jewish learning. The way they learned, youth and aged, up to the last moments of their lives until they were thrown into the gas chambers, will stand forever as one of the most glorious pages in our history. This should be our unforgettable lesson everywhere at all times. The implications of Ravidovich's speech could not have been clearer, and this was repeated in one way or another all across the spectrum of American Jewry, all across the landscape of Jewish communities in the United States. If Jews could keep on studying Jewish texts in the death camps, then surely they could and should do the same in Chicago, the United States. The catastrophe provided the leadership of American Jewry with a powerful tool as it went about constructing, or hoping to construct, a self-sustaining, intense Jewish life in America. While those who invoked the Holocaust to remind American Jews of their new role in the world, the largest Jewish community, hopefully they expected the creator of new Jewish culture, American Jews, their leaders differed dramatically, radically among themselves as to what that might mean. That is, the Reform and the Orthodox had very different views of what an intense Jewish culture would mean. The Yiddishists had a different view, the Zionists had a different view, but they all agreed on the notion that the Holocaust made the project of making American Jews more Jewish, more compelling than ever. They operated on a hunch that the catastrophic events of Europe would in fact move American Jews as nothing had done before in terms of getting them to commit to a deeper Jewish life. Post-war American Jews went about the process of fashioning and participating in a commemorative culture based on the Holocaust from scratch. They had no obvious precedent which guided them as they took their first steps towards creating new ceremonies, writing new liturgies, and orchestrating pageants which took as their theme the horrendous story of death and destruction. They had a very hard time turning to traditional Jewish sources because they had no reason to believe that they, as modern American Jews, had the right to, for example, create new prayers or to create new day on new days on the Jewish calendar. They felt they didn't have some of them believed they had no right to do this. So the Seder of Remembrance that I began with was opposed by the Orthodox. Okay, not because they didn't want to remember the Holocaust or they didn't share in the sense of extreme emotional tragedy about it, but they said the Haggadah, the Passover book, is a fixed text. We may not put anything new in it. We can't do that. Okay, the Reform and the Conservative disagreed with the Orthodox, but here was a difference between them, and the past was not a guide as to how to go about fashioning a new, authentic kind of memorial culture. So too, American Jews had no local or no domestic partners to help them. Nearly nothing like this existed in the general American culture, which American Jews could adopt for their own and use to mark their catastrophe. They couldn't look around and see any other ethnic community presenting itself to the larger society through a devastating tragedy, let alone one perpetrated on foreign shores. No minority group in America had as yet created a museum, erected a massive monument on public space, organized university courses that focused on highly public, on such painful events in their past. American Jews had to embark upon this on their own with no domestic partners and no models to help them as they went about this. Discussions about how to memorialize the Holocaust reflected the inner cleavages and pluralistic nature of American Jewry. American Jewish life got lived out in thousands of local communities, each made up of multiple institutions, divided by ideology, function, class, length of time in the United States. No national body directed the group, okay, that is, nobody told them what they had to do. And indeed, the utter disorganization of the American Jewish polity, its unwillingness to follow directions from any central agency, because they had no central agency, provided one of the leitmotifs of American Jewish history. Each organization, each institution, each local community did what it wanted and what its constituents deemed appropriate. So, to bring this to an end, in that anarchic environment, no one opposed recalling the victims of the Holocaust. Okay? Nobody opposed aiding the survivors or pointing to the evil of the perpetrators. Nor did anyone disagree on the premise that Jewish communal institutions, schools for the young, seminaries which trained rabbis, the Jewish press, the multiplicity of organizations, philanthropic, cultural, political, and religious, all had a share in remembering the 6 million and in using that memory to shape the post-war world. But since they had no guides or no leadership, no central authority which would tell them what to do, they all did what they wanted and what they believed fit the dimensions of the catastrophe. Thank you.
I thank you very much for this rich and illuminating paper, and we have like about 20 minutes left, so please pose your questions.
Professor Deine, I only wanted to ask you about, can you say something about the relevance of the text of Sommer Morgenstern, the third pillar, in context of prayer books and new texts in liturgies and...
Okay, could you repeat the first part of your question? Well, I mean, when the book came out, it was very widely reviewed in the Jewish press. It received awards from the Jewish Book Council. So it was one of many books that were published in that period. There were, in fact, so many books published about the Holocaust in English and in Yiddish. As of the mid-1950s, the Jewish Book Annuals, it's a compendium every year that listed all the Jewish books that came out, said that it was going to have a special category called Churban literature, okay, because there are so many texts of one kind or another that had come out. So I can't speak specifically about it other than to say it was very widely reviewed, and it was certainly a text which was very much admired by the German Jewish community in the United States.
Okay, perhaps we collect like 2 questions now.
Yeah, I found it very interesting to hear that the Jewish community, the American Jewish community, took the leadership on the memory of the Holocaust. But what I found even more interesting is that Israel did the same, and Israel, since its beginning, also decided that she is actually the leadership. She is the only one to tell the world how to remember and so on. And I didn't hear in your presentation any reference from the American Jewry towards the Israelis.
Okay, well, yeah. Okay, so I tried to give a kind of broad overview. So it's very interesting that at a number of points there was actually a great deal of conflict between American Jewish organizations, okay, and Israel in one way or another over the memorialization of the Holocaust. And so the leadership at Yad Vashem, among other institutions, was really monitoring very closely memorial activities in the United States and sending off letters saying, you know, don't do this. Okay, you shouldn't be building a memorial of this kind or another. And in most cases, American Jewry actually gave in. Okay, that is, okay, well, we won't do it. The letters were really quite dramatic. And so for example, the Federation of Bessarabian Jews wanted to put up a memorial in Europe, in Bessarabia, and the people at Yad Vashem wrote, if you want to have a memorial, send the money to us and it will put it up. That's what Yad Vashem is supposed to be. So rather than having your autonomous projects, it should be done here. So it was an issue of great conflict in terms of the observance of the 10th of Tevet, which was very widely observed in the United States through the 1950s, came to a kind of radical end in 1959 when Yom HaShoah was created. And the Synagogue Council of America was furious, so that in their inner discussions, they said, how could they do this? How could they, there aren't going to be two Memorial Days. We want to have a unified Jewish world. And we have created a whole liturgy over dealing with the 10th of Tevet, but yet in the end they gave in. Okay, so it's very significant.
Hi. Recently I was looking at a high holiday prayer book at our local synagogue, and I noticed that there's a prayer for the Holocaust, for the victims, and it says the following phrase, sort of, we remember those who are gassed at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and then it lists Theresienstadt. Now, of course, Theresienstadt didn't have a gas chamber. Nowadays, unfortunately, somebody might seize that and say, oh, this horrible Arab neo-Nazis will make something of it. But I traced it to Morris Silverman, a rabbi from West Hartford, rather,
yes,
whom you know,
absolutely.
of course, the 1940s, and it struck, I was just curious, are there other examples before sort of Auschwitz becomes the symbol, or before we know so much through our own scholarship, where you find like sort of things that are, like I've seen Majdanek as the embodiment of evil, not Auschwitz, or this notion that Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Treblinka where people were gassed. Do you see that kind of sort of?
Oh, well, yeah. I'm going to answer it on two levels. So for one thing, they're constantly making mistakes. I mean, they're just making mistakes, and in a way they engage in a kind of rhetorical flourish that scholars, would say, well, that's just not the case. So 6 million Jews were not gassed. Okay, 6 million Jews weren't in the concentration camps, but that is one of the phrases that keeps happening, or that they kept invoking. So the fact that they got it wrong, in some ways is, I think, a comment on how little scholarship there had been at the time and how little they actually knew in terms of the real, shall we say, nitty-gritty details. But I don't think it would have bothered them at all. What they cared about was this memorialization, and the factuality of it was not on their minds. You see these places like Auschwitz and Treblinka and Majdanek all compete. It's not so much competing, but they'll use one or the other. Sometimes they use, by the way, the phrase Warsaw Ghetto, not to mean the heroic resistance, but they use Warsaw Ghetto as, the great tragedy. Okay, so that, in one text or another, that comes to incorporate the idea of, the 6 million, so that one could really look, almost document where they say what and when it's off, and to try to figure out why different symbols or different phrases are invoked by different constituencies at different times. But I don't think I'm trying to imagine them, it wouldn't have bothered them whatsoever if you said, oh no, that didn't actually happen that way. They wanted this memorialization to be there on paper or on stone, and it didn't.
Just as a follow-up, I did tell some people, technically,
right.
at Theresienstadt, they were gas chambers because I teach this, and they even now the point they still don't care, because nor should they. It's about the prayer itself and the memorial. But it was fascinating. They may not have cared then, and even now people were much less interested than somebody who teaches the Holocaust in what had gas chambers and what didn't.
It's very interesting. Dachau was a very potent symbol. Okay, now it was a potent symbol partly because it was in fact liberated by the Americans, and in a sense the Americans knew that phrase, and I've seen references to gas chambers at Dachau. Now again, we know that wasn't the case, but it doesn't matter. Okay.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I have a question. You told us that what the American Jews did is what they wanted to do, and it was kind of an autonomous action which had no example. I would be interested to hear what you think about the idea of Herzberg laid out in his book Shalom America, that this memorialization of a Holocaust had also a certain function for American Jewry because they used to be split in very different fractions and went through kind of an identity crisis, maybe also because they couldn't hinder the Holocaust or couldn't stop the murder, and so after the Holocaust, this served as a means for unifying American Jewry.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if everybody heard the question. It was a very complicated question. So, did the Holocaust unify American Jewry? No, because I think that I think the process of unification or the process of homogenization of American Jewry was a demographic one rather than an ideological one. That is, just if we look at this in terms of time, by 1930, a majority of American Jews were American-born. Okay, so that all of the distinctions of the immigrant era were, in a way, being flattened out as you had an increasingly American-born population. It was an increasingly middle-class population. The Jewish working class was just dying in droves, that is, and their children weren't going into the working class. So it was becoming American-born, it was becoming white-collar and professional, middle class. Many of the political divisions, for example, the communist era of the 1930s, certainly was ended as American Jews became universally political liberals associated with the Democratic Party. By 1950, a majority of Americans belonged to synagogues. Okay, and most belong to conservative synagogues. But I think this is a demographic phenomenon, the maturation of the children of the immigrants, and this coincided with the aftermath of the Holocaust. I think it would have happened even without the Holocaust. That is, the kind of flattening of so many of the distinctions that mattered a great deal in the earlier part of the century.
So, are there other questions? So maybe I put one. Okay. I wondered, I mean, after all we've heard from you and heard in that conference, it seems even more striking to see what you termed the myth of silence. So would you try to...
Okay, so the myth of silence, which I chose not to talk about in this presentation, is the kind of historical paradigm which begins to get heard in the late 1960s, which essentially said that the post-war generation, the adults who ran the synagogues, who led the Jewish communal institutions, who were the teachers, and so on, purposely withheld the story of the Holocaust from young people, and that they would not, could not, did not discuss the Holocaust in their engagements with other Americans. That is, it was an age of silence. One writer has said there was a virtual taboo about talking about the Holocaust in the post-war period. Nobody wanted to hear, nobody would talk about it. So this is a paradigm that we begin, or a message that we begin to hear in the late 1960s, initially articulated by young Jewish radicals, okay, in that kind of age of American kind of young people kind of coming to their political kind of shall we say, becoming caught up in the political struggles of the late 1960s. And for young Jews involved in the radical movement, this became a very potent way to condemn what they saw as the bourgeois assimilationist practices of the American Jewish community. And the young people, were much more militant. They were nationalist. They were going to do what their parents had not. Okay, it's a paradigm that continued to be heard on a communal level, but by the 1980s, it begins to move into scholarship. Okay, so that scholars repeated this same statement with strikingly no documentation. And so it was indeed Peter Novick's book, The Holocaust in American Life, which inspired me not so much to write this as I did, but inspired me to actually look at the primary sources and to ask, well, was this actually the case? And obviously I found that it was not the case. And so it's in some ways very interesting that the notion that silence was the dominant theme was picked up by scholars who fell, I'd say, into two groups. And so I think Novick and others who I'd put on the political left, okay, obviously these are kind of gross terms, but who considered that the kind of a memorialization of the Holocaust which comes to the fore in the 1980s and beyond was not something they admired very much at all, and that they believed that its purpose was really not to memorialize the Holocaust, but basically to do the political work of American Jews, particularly vis-a-vis Israel. Because that's the reason for this, and that it has really nothing to do with remembering the Holocaust. There's, however, interestingly, I think, a swath from the right that make the same statement, and I put actually Arthur Hertzberg in that category, which was that they articulated the position that it's not until the late 60s, and particularly after the 67 war in Israel, that American Jews had something they could suddenly be proud of, and that until then they lived in this kind of sense of shame about the Holocaust. And Israel, in some ways, kind of pushed them out of the closet and emboldened them to talk about that which they couldn't talk about before. And I think very strikingly, the left and the right made these contentions with no evidence. And so I went into the project with, I'd say, an open mind. I mean, I didn't think they were right, but who knew? And was really quite overwhelmed by the degree to which this theme pops up. Okay, not only in the places where you'd expect it, but in places where it was just, in a sense, part of the landscape of American Jewish public culture in the post-war period.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to add something or a question to this topic. Is there any parallel, if you said that this paradigm was from the late 1960s, that the radical Jews condemned or said that nothing had happened, is there any parallel to the 1968 radical movements in Central Europe? Mm. And the other question would be, is there also an intergenerational silence? Maybe some of them had experienced in their families, which maybe was the reason for that.
Okay, so two really good questions. So, for in terms of the sort of eruption of student protest in Central Europe in '68, well, this is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just Central Europe. And so there is this just kind of mass movement around the world of young people questioning the basic values of the societies in which they lived and the political arrangements which we might say their parents had, if not approved of, at least were willing to live with. And so that, well, I can understand while Central Europe would be your focus, this is taking place all over. And the United States was obviously a real hotbed. It grew out of the civil rights movement. It was very much part of the protest against the war in Vietnam. And it really revolutionized the kind of generational relationships. okay, among others. And so it was part and parcel of that. And the idea that the adults who had run these institutions, okay, the adults who had been in charge, as far as the young people were concerned, were corrupt, and that they had never, that the institutions they oversaw were not humane, and the young people were going to kind of take them over and humanize them. So in the United States, one of the slogans of the youth culture was, and it's very funny in retrospect, never trust anyone over 30. Okay, well, you know, so the people who are over 30 are the ones who are in charge of those institutions that you were raised in, and therefore everything they did had to be bad. And bad in the thinking of that generation was avoiding controversy. Okay, and so the rhetoric of young American Jews, our parents wouldn't talk about the Holocaust, was paralleled by the rhetoric of, for example, young Japanese Americans saying, our parents and our communities never talked about the internment during World War II. Okay, now that was equally fallacious. That's just not the case, but that became the sort of slogan of the young radicals within that community. Young African Americans, you know, part of the Black Power movement, said that the generation that ran the African American churches and so on were compromisers, and they really didn't confront slavery and its legacy. They were going to do it. So this is really kind of across the board. Now, the other question about what went on in their homes. Well, how would I know? They say, nobody in my home ever talked about it. As a historian, one can never reconstruct that, but one can reconstruct the institutions that they participated in. And so we have the question about the conservative movement prayer book. Okay, so I mean, this was, again, the most commonly used prayer book, most commonly used high holiday prayer book, and the vast majority of American Jews attended synagogue on the high holidays. So anybody who said, I belong to a conservative synagogue and it was never talked about, was wrong, okay? Maybe they don't remember it, but it was there. You know, the words are on paper. What did their parents talk about at the dinner table? I can't know. But ironically, Peter Novick said talk about the Holocaust never went beyond the kitchen table. But it's indeed exactly the kitchen table that you can't reconstruct. The public sphere you can.
So we'll give a last question here. We're actually running out of time. I'm sorry.
Would it be okay if I ask this question in German? Or?
I mean, somebody will have to translate it, because I'll only pick up every fifth word.
Okay, es schließt daran an, was gerade gefragt wurde, nämlich zu dem intergenerationellen Schweigen, weil ich mich auch gerade gefragt habe, es gibt aber auch doch psychoanalytische Studien, die sagen, dass es aber so ein Schweigen eben gab, bis in die 50er, 60er, 70er Jahre hinein. Also das wäre sozusagen, also nicht der Küchentisch, sondern die Psychoanalyse, also die Couch, dass da aber auch gesagt wurde, dass es so ein Schweigen gab. Das wollte ich noch mal kurz nachfragen.
Again, about the families and the inner silence, and that psychoanalysis actually said it's a part of the trauma.
Well, you know, yeah, okay, so I mean, it's a great question, but it's just one that can't be, in a sense, subjected to the kind of tools that a historian would use. But let me give you, however, an interesting example, or maybe counter. So certainly part of this discourse is that the survivors came to the United States, about 100,000 Holocaust survivors came to the United States, and that nobody wanted to know what had happened to them. Okay, so this is a statement that's made over and over and over again. Okay, so in the course of my research, one of the things I found were dozens and dozens of articles in Jewish newspapers and magazines interviewing Holocaust survivors and asking, having them tell their stories. Okay, and so I once gave a talk. It happened to be in Chicago, and I gave a talk based on the local Chicago Jewish newspaper called the Chicago Jewish Sentinel. And so And I focused on one article, okay, it's one of many, and it was a 2-page interview with a family that had come to Chicago. They were survivors, and the headline was something like, lost 250 family members buried alive for 2 years. And so I gave a lecture, and I talked about this article, and so somebody in the audience said, well, you know, my parents were survivors, and they said nobody ever asked them, and in fact, people told them, we don't want to know what happened. And I said, I can't know what, happened, but here's the Chicago Jewish Sentinel of, May 3rd, 1950, and there's a 2-page article that's an interview with this family, and obviously the reporter thought it was a very good idea to write this article, and the family agreed to it. We even see their picture, right, sitting at a table with a big bowl of fruit, which is very common to show the bounty of American life, and the editor published it. The publisher was okay with it, and then I said, you'll have to take my word for it. There were no angry letters to the editor in subsequent weeks saying, don't publish it. But in this, and the answer to me was, you're totally wrong. Okay, nobody wanted to know. So the psychological literature on survivors said that that's what happened, but I think the historical evidence where you can get at these public forums is very different. And at many of those Warsaw Ghetto memorial programs that I talked about, you can just see the program, and it said, it says on the program, recollections of life in the ghetto by, okay, and there is, a survivor who got up and spoke to an audience. Or you can take something as ubiquitous as the Iskerbücher. Okay, so these were memorial books published by people from particular towns in Poland. And they're full of, articles by people saying, an article on how the Germans come into the town, or remembrances of the rabbis of the town, or remembrance. So they're telling the story all over the place. So I don't know how we square that with the psychological literature, other than this story got planted in people's minds and just gets retold without really analyzing them in the light of empirical data.
So I understood that we actually have to close now. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so I really warmly thank you for your talk and your discussion, and thank you for the questions.
I look forward to hearing about your project.